Hi, everybody, and thank you coming to our webinar, Is a Used Electric Car Right for You? We hope you gain a lot out of this webinar. My name is Devin DeLibero. I am the Electric Vehicle Program Coordinator here at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I work on the Drive Green program. Okay, so just some webinar logistics. Everyone is muted to avoid background noise. We will have regular breaks for questions, so please send them via chat. I will have one of my coworkers, Kelly Shin, she'll be answering some questions in the chat and reading them to me when we have our breaks. This webinar will be recorded and we will share it after the fact, and I'm also going to share the slides with you as well, so you'll have everything you should need. A little bit about us. So we are Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We are a nonprofit that works in Massachusetts and Rhode Island that was founded in 1982. Our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. And we do that with our program and advocacy work, so particularly with Drive Green. Vehicle emissions are one of the greater emissions contributing to climate change, so we thought we should really focus on electric vehicles. So let's get to it. In this webinar, I'm going to cover a handful of different topics surrounding used vehicles. So we'll talk about the state of the market, the benefits of buying a pre-owned electric vehicle, the battery health and the warranties associated with batteries, also popular electric cars to buy that are pre-owned, and plus our used EV shopping tool. So, and you will see me interchange pre-owned and used a lot in this webinar. I think we both all know that they mean the same thing, but pre-owned is a term that the dealerships prefer, and used is, I think, a term that a lot of customers prefer. Okay, so let's start off strong with the inventory and the state of the market. So, the state of the market for EVs and cars in general is actually quite different than it was from the start of the pandemic. So it used to be that you could go to a dealership that day and pick out a car, test drive it, and then leave with that car the same day. Well, it's not quite the case anymore, especially for electric vehicles. So one reason for that is that there is a global semiconductor chip shortage. This chip shortage is easing, but it is still not there yet. So basically, semiconductor chips are needed for all vehicles now, but during the pandemic, there was a severe decrease in demand for vehicles because no one was going anywhere. And manufacturers had to focus on more profitable industries, mainly like personal electronics and things like that. And so now these manufacturers are switching gears again and ramping up production for cars, but it still hasn't gotten up to where it needs to be. There are other supply chain issues, whether that be for battery minerals, battery components, or just other parts of the vehicle in general. I'm sure you've heard about other supply chain issues in other industries, while they're very prevalent in the electric vehicle and car markets as well. So both of these things have led to an increased electric vehicle prices, both new and used. So for new EVs in particular, the status quo really is that you are going to put a pre-order down at the dealership, or you even do it on the manufacturer's website itself, which will require a deposit and a lead time from anywhere from a few weeks, if you're lucky, to like 6 months or more. It can really, it can just, be a harder time to buy a vehicle nowadays. So this supply chain shortages and the semiconductor chip shortages have also led to a push in release dates for EVs. So like the Nissan Ariya is a really great example of that. People are super excited about that, but I believe the release date got pushed back by like a year and a half, if I'm remembering correctly. So that's kind of made things a little bit trickier. So now with all the things happening in the new EV market, it's really led to a change in the used EV market. So it's meant that there is an increased demand and increased prices for used EVs. And then now there's a used EV scarcity. So you really have to do your homework to try to find these vehicles. So now we'll go to second topic is why should you buy a pre-owned electric car? So there is a federal clean vehicle credit for used cars that just came online this year. Here is a list of the manufacturers and models of qualified used cars that you can find on the IRS website, which is really handy. I'm just going to go over the benefits and what you need to know about this clean vehicle credit. So there are battery requirements for new EVs that do not apply for used EVs. So just know that off the bat because that can make things confusing. For used EVs, the tax credit is $4,000 or 30% of the sale price, whichever is lower. But I do want to stress that it is based on your personal tax liability, so keep that in mind when you're shopping around. You also must buy your used EV from a car dealership, so it has to be a licensed car dealership, so no Craigslist, unfortunately. The car has to be 2 years or older and cost $25,000 or less. And this only applies to the first resale, so if you're the third owner and the previous owner already applied for and received the used car credit, you cannot receive it. And it has an income threshold that's different from the new clean vehicle credit of $150,000 for joint filers and $75,000 for individual filers. So this is kind of like nitty-gritty details, but it is good to know if you're considering buying a used vehicle. It's really important information. There are also state incentives to think about. So Rhode Island has a program called Drive EV that's both for new and used vehicles, but we'll talk about the used vehicles credits. So if you buy an all-electric car, which is no gas backup, you get $1,500 of a rebate, and you can get an additional $1,500 with Drive EV Plus program, but that is a program where you have income qualifiers, and it's usually for low to moderate income folks. It does also work for plug-in hybrids, which is a car that has a little bit of electric range and a gas backup. So you can get $750 for the regular Drive EV rebate and $750 for the Plus. It does come with qualifiers though, so there is a $40,000 price cap, and you have to apply on Drive EV's website in 120 days. And you must purchase this from a Rhode Island dealership, which, in all honesty, I think some people are finding a problem with because there's just limited inventory right now, and Rhode Island we're pretty small. In Massachusetts, so there's a program called More EV. As it stands right now, there's nothing for used EVs, but there is legislation that has been put into place that will allow for a used EV state incentive. We just don't know when that's actually going to be made available, so stay tuned on that. Okay, so another great reason to get a used EV is that it cuts down on emissions. So there'll be no manufacturing emissions when you get a used EV. So all those little buckets, the blue and orange buckets you see here on the graph, don't matter because the car is already past that stage. You're not putting any more demand for a new vehicle like that. But just to talk a little bit more about this graph in front of us, it is really interesting to note that EVs do have more of a manufacturing emissions associated with them, but over the life cycle of these cars, they really have far fewer emissions than their gas-powered counterparts. There is even a break-even point that the Union of Concerned Scientists mentions in this article that we've referenced here on the slide. So for the break-even point, the EV needs to drive to match initial emissions debts. For a car, it's 21,000 miles roughly, and for an electric truck, it's 17,500 miles. So it won't take too long. This will vary a little bit by regional electricity emissions, but generally speaking, it is better for the environment to drive a used EV, even a new EV. And now we're just going to compare a few different car types. So one of them is going to be like your traditional economical gas-powered sedan, and then 2 crossovers that are EVs. So for a used Honda Civic, the price to buy this car is about $20,000. In fact, all of these prices are pretty similar, with the Bolt being a little bit more expensive to buy. So it doesn't sound too bad at first. But then you want to consider the MPG, or the miles per gallon equivalent, for electric vehicles. And you can see that there's a stark difference between a gas-powered car and an all-electric car. Moving on, you'll see that the fuel prices are also quite different. So this is just for 1 year. And I got these numbers from the fuel economy government website, so you can definitely check those out on your own, or look at different models later if you're interested. So this is in 1 year, assuming that the car is driven 15,000 miles. So for a Honda Civic, it's about $1,600 to fuel a car in a year. For a Nissan Leaf Plus, it's about $657, and for a Bolt, it's $602. So you can see right there that the savings is already coming at you for a EV, or especially a used EV. And it already makes the price cheaper to buy the Bolt than the Honda Civic. Now, with all those things in mind, you also want to consider the federal and state incentives that you could potentially apply for, which will bring the car prices down even more for the electric vehicles. So basically, this is a great way to show you that there are really great options for used electric vehicles that are even better price-wise for you than their gas-powered counterparts. Now, these two cars, it is worthy to note that their ranges are different than their gas-powered counterparts. So for a Nissan Leaf Plus, the range was about 226, I believe, and the Chevy Bolt, the original range is 259. Now we'll go over a little bit how that changes over time, but you can expect that it'll be roughly about the same for both of those cars. Now we're going to compare them to using the new versions of each car. So the Honda Civic is the cheapest car to buy off the bat, it seems like, right away. Then again, you want to factor in your fuel costs, and you'll see that really that changes pretty quickly because the fuel costs will bring it down. And then again, there are federal and state incentives for new electric vehicles, so that'll bring the car down even more. And it's worthy to note that the Chevy Bolt has a range of 259 in this case, and the Leaf has a range of 226 miles. And then there are also savings compared by age at purchase with best-selling gas vehicles. So you can see, there are still savings to consider. All EV drivers save money compared to gas drivers over the lifetime of their vehicle because of lower fuel and maintenance costs. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to show you where there's one exception to the lower fuel cost rule, so to speak, because for as long as I've been doing this for over 5 years, this is the first point of time where gas prices and prices of running your car in a mile of gas have been comparable to electric vehicles. So, excuse me. In the past few months, and even till now, electricity rates went up by quite a bit of money. So what that means is that the price to run your car on a mile of electricity has gone up, and it's on comparison with running your car on a mile of gasoline. So for National Grid customers, that meant it was 14 cents a mile on electricity. Eversource customers, it's 11 cents a mile. And Rhode Island Energy customers, it's 9 cents a mile. We did do some math, which you'll see here on the right-hand side. We did a gas comparison, and we took the 6-month average in New England of gas prices, which was, excuse me, $4.26 per gallon. which equaled to 14 cents a mile. Now this is an average, and we did this math the end of November. I did do a more recent cost comparison earlier this month, where the average gallon of gasoline in Massachusetts was $3.30 roughly, which translates to 11 cents per mile. So you'll see here using the table that the price for Eversource customers is pretty equal for electricity and gas for running your car. It's still a little bit cheaper if you're a Rhode Island Energy customer, and you're not saving anything, actually spending a little bit more if you are a National Grid customer. And this is the first time I've ever seen this happen. It's always been cheaper to drive your car with electricity versus gas. However, it is important to note that there are supply cost changes that have been proposed and should be taking effect soon for Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So for the changing the supply cost changing for National Grid is proposed at 14.12 cents per kilowatt hour, and that's supposed to take place in May. And for Rhode Island Energy, it's 10.7 cents per kilowatt hour, and that's supposed to happen in April. So I don't have all of the math with the supply and delivery combined together, but just know that these prices should come down a little bit, and we'll have more math for you soon on our website. And this is just where you can find that math on our website. EVs are also a really great option for many different lifestyles and budgets. Depending upon the year and the range of the vehicle, depends what your use is going to be for that car. So if you're getting a car with lesser range, it'll be really great for people who are retired or mostly driving like around town, just doing your day-to-day like small activities. Could also be good for a two-car household where someone is doing their day-to-day activities or like, driving around town, and then they have a second car for doing longer trips. It's really great for families with teenage drivers. That way they can only get so far. And it's really great for drivers looking for low cost of ownership and low maintenance costs, because EVs have way fewer maintenance costs, and we'll talk more about that in further slides. And some EVs have really great ranges, so they're good for your daily commute and your errands, things like that. They're even really great for road trips. The general rule is the farther back you go, the less the range will most likely be, and as far as battery degradation goes, and as far as just like the technology at the time. And I'll show you what that looks like in certain cars later. So like the Leaf, for example, started with a really low range and now has quite a bit of range. We have an example about that later. But you could get a car like a used 2020 Chevy Bolt, which has 259 miles of range. Get that at a really great price, and you can still do your road trips and do all of your normal driving because you still have that really great range. Another reason to go with the used EV is for all the reasons to go electric in general. So there are no noxious tailpipe emissions coming out of your tailpipe because you don't have a tailpipe with an EV, at least an all electric vehicle. So really that means that public health is going to be better because you're not putting all that particular matter out into the air, which can cause respiratory illnesses or further asthma problems and things like that. EVs are also really quiet, and they provide a really smooth ride. I personally can hear the little like whistle thing that they make. So it's like a telltale sign of an EV, but they're generally very quiet. And then charging is really convenient. So charging can be done on the go. It can be done when you're at home. So like overnight, you just plug your car in like you would your phone, and then it's done and ready for you in the morning. Or if you have a long commute, you charge it at work if that's available to you. And then it's ready for you to go about your business at the end of the day, which is really awesome. There's also, if you use certain charging apps like PlugShare, for example, you can find free charging or charging that you still have to pay for, but sometimes you can luck out and find some free charging, which is even better. Okay, I'm going to take a break, drink a water, and I'm going to see if there's any questions. One question is, a person is confused about how to calculate or find my prior tax return to know what their tax liability is and determine how much of a used EV tax credit they'd get. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that question. I would really encourage you to talk to a tax professional or someone that's really great with taxes in general. But I don't know that. I do know that it is a barrier for some folks because it looks like you're going to get this money and you're like, oh, this is great, but then you find out that you can't. If you find once you do your research that you don't have that tax liability, what I would suggest is that you wait until 2024. Because in 2024, the rules change a bit because it goes from a rebate, which is dependent upon your personal tax liability, to a point of sale discount. Because then the dealerships are going to have the option of taking that onto themselves and giving it directly to the customer. So just know if you have a little wiggle room, 2024 might be a better bet for you. Okay, this is a really great question. It says, I would hesitate to buy a car sight unseen because I like to sit behind the wheel, test the ergonomics, play with the infotainment system, etc. What are my options for test driving if dealers do not have any particular model in stock or pre-owned or new? So Kelly did answer this question, but I just think it is worth voicing, and thank you, Kelly, for answering. We have developed a really great group on Facebook. It's called the Drive Green Community Group, where there's tons of EV drivers on there that are super friendly. There's people who are really new to EVs, and there's people who are like super experts, know all these crazy things that you would never think you would want to know. And some folks would even let you probably test drive their car if you're interested. I would just recommend writing a post. Alternatively, you can reach out to me once I send an email around and ask me if there's a particular car that you're interested in, and I can see if we have any EV ambassadors who are our volunteers who have those types of cars and would be willing to connect with you. And then someone says, how soon into 2024 should we wait for the tax credit to go to the dealer and be point of sale? We don't have a specific date yet. The federal government hasn't announced that. They just said 2024. We don't know yet whether that's January 1st or just sometime into 2024. I think the wording is like purposely vague because it is a process that is kind of complicated and they have to figure out the ins and outs of it. And so I think that's why they're giving themselves so much leeway with it. So stay tuned. We'll definitely write blogs and have presentations and things like that about that when it's live. Okay. I'm going to continue on with the presentation for now. I think we got to most of those questions. So now we're going to talk about battery health. Hold on one second. My screen is a little funky. Okay. So electric cars will provide you more peace of mind than a gasoline-powered car, and we say that for a few reasons. So a common concern when drivers are considering switching over to an electric car is about the battery. So namely, how long it will last and how much does it cost to replace. So before we answer those questions, we're going to give you a little bit of background information. So I think we're all relatively familiar with lithium-ion batteries, which power our phones and laptops and pretty much our everyday lives. The batteries in electric vehicles are on the same technology, but they're just a much larger scale. So about 10,000 times the storage capacity of a smartphone. The battery pack for an electric car lives not underneath the hood, but it's actually where you would find, it's actually like at the bottom. It's like under the floorboards of your car, and then the rest of the car is built around it. So kind of think of it kind of like a skateboard. And it's actually really beneficial too because it makes the car have a lower center of gravity, which increases the safety of it. Because if it gets hit in it, where a gas car would typically roll, it's less likely that electric car will roll because it's so heavy at the bottom. And it's also why EVs have good handling. because all the weight at the bottom is at the bottom of the car. There are a bunch of individual cell packs that you can see on the right-hand side. And you can see that they fit into the entire battery module, like just right there. So it's really tiny. However, batteries in electric cars are much more sophisticated than batteries in laptops or smartphones because they're used at a much higher duty. So more power, there's more storage. They use complex heating and cooling systems to keep them at the right temperature, and they're engineered to have as long of a life as possible, which you can't really say for smartphones and laptops. I'm shouting out Apple products right there. And here's just a simple table for the repairs of gas engines versus electric vehicle engines, and how that can be a little bit more, it can be pricier if you have a gas-powered car versus an electric vehicle. You don't save as much if you have a plug-in hybrid versus a battery electric vehicle, which is an all-electric car, because it still has those still has an engine and oil and things like that. So a major plus for electric cars, especially a pre-owned electric car though, is how reliable they are. They still have, every bit of technology has a lifespan, and batteries are no exception to that. So battery degradation is a natural process that reduces the amount of energy the battery can store over time. We do measure we measure battery condition according to state of health, or SOH for short. SOH starts at 100% and deteriorates over time, and it's a measure of how much energy the battery can store compared to itself when it was new. Overall, the data shows that EV batteries hold up over time. According to data from over 6,000 different vehicles, you can expect to lose about 10% range over 6 years. That means if you're worried about having to replace the battery, you don't have to be. The battery will outlast the life of the car, which we'll show you another slide soon that shows you that. The graph here is an average of all sorts of vehicle models and years, and though it's not exactly linear, it's about a 2.3% drop every year, and you'll barely notice that as a driver of the car. And then most importantly, it's not like you'll experience a sudden failure, which is what most people seem to be afraid of with their cars. And this is actually pretty important. So there are other factors that can contribute to battery decline. Exposure to high temperatures, consistently charging using DC fast charging speeds, which is like the fastest level of charging, or charging to 100% and then draining back down to 0% every day. Basically, you want to stay in like a sweet spot, if you can, for the most part, between like 10 and like 80%. Generally speaking, if you'll notice, if you charge your iPhone or whatever phone you have to 100% all the time, it wears down the battery over time. So if you, just like I said with the car, if you'll see that with your phone too at a smaller scale. But engineers know all of this, and so they have prepared, and that's why they use good thermal management systems to keep the battery at the right temperature. It's also why they build a little excess capacity into the battery that's not usable, because it protects the capacity of the battery. So there's usually like about a 10% extra capacity that we don't know about. But what about the battery? So the actual rate of degradation does depend on make, model, and year. So we'll just go through a comparison. The comparison is going to be for the Nissan Leaf. Now, might be some confusion here because the Nissan has like two kinds of cars under one name. The Nissan Leaf, I think, has a 40 kilowatt battery pack, which means its range is lower. It's about 150 miles. And the Nissan Leaf Plus is 226. We're going to talk about the Leaf, the regular Leaf with the lesser range. So the 2017 version of this car has a slower rate of decline, which is a testament to the improved battery technology. Also, 200 plus miles of range is a new norm, and batteries that have higher capacity fare better in the long term. It's because you're not constantly depleting it. So again, that's because using the entire capacity of the battery is more taxing on it than just a small portion of it, so greater range is really a better place to start. It is a lot easier to discharge the car from 100% to 0% if you only have 100 miles of range compared to 250 miles of range. So that's part of the reason why you want to see the rate of decline changing from year to year. Not why you want to, but why you do see the rate of decline changing from year to year. So you might use this for an older EV to predict how much the actual driving capacity of your car has. So for example, say you're looking at a 2016 Nissan Leaf. After 4 years of driving, it loses about 10% of its battery capacity, which translates to about 11 miles of range. So that's not too bad. So your maximum range might be 96 miles instead of 107. So sorry, it's very confusing. The Nissan Leaf starts at all different ranges. So this 2016 model starts at 107. Losing 11 miles of range over a 4-year period gives you 96 miles. Another thing you can take away from this is that buying a 2016 Leaf is a better idea than a 2014 Leaf, for example. And just remember, this is all a comparison for the battery, so just make sure you're doing all of your homework. Or if you don't want to do so much homework, we found a really great tool that will do some of the homework for you. So Recurrent Auto is linked here at the bottom, and they are a really great organization. One of their specific projects that they're working on is a used EV project where they try to help you figure out the range of the vehicle and the battery health. So what you do is you go on their website and you find you come with the VIN number of the car that you're looking at. So for me, I went on Kelley Blue Book. I just typed in 2020 Chevy Bolt, picked the first VIN number I found, and this is what I came up with. So the purchase price for this car, it is it's the higher trim. It's about $31,000. It does specifically tell you what the odometer range is. You'll see on the top left-hand side, it's 8,563 miles. And they tell you also what range you can expect of the vehicle. So this vehicle started at 259 miles, and they expect it to be anywhere from 222 to 244 miles of range left. Also tells you, if you go down a little bit on the left-hand side, it tells you a little bit about the battery warranty that's left. And manufacturers do, we'll talk about it a little later, they say 8 years, 100,000 miles sort of thing. So it tells you the time or the mileage, whichever comes first. It tells you the battery size, which is really great. And then it tells you things in the middle, what your range is going to look like if you're in cold temperature, ideal temperatures, or really hot temperatures. So you'll see in cold, which is good to know for everybody, in cold weather, the range of your EV will decrease. So in 15 degrees Fahrenheit weather, they expect that the range will decrease to about 74%. And then again, there's on the right-hand side, there's just more about the battery and the warranty. So just interesting stuff to know, especially if you're considering a particular vehicle that you have in mind. You want to check out how it should be doing. There it is. I've been kind of alluding to this slide a couple different times during this presentation. Warranties will cover a battery replacement if something goes wrong. Most manufacturers have an 8-year, 100,000 mile warranty on their batteries or thereabouts. So you'll see, I just picked a handful of the more popular models that are on the market right now. Some of them go above and beyond this. So the Prius Prime, which is the only plug-in hybrid example that I'm using here, has more years and more miles on it. And then the Tesla Model 3 is 8 years, but 120,000 miles, which is pretty cool. And what's really good to know here is most manufacturers will transfer the battery warranty to the second-hand owner. So, it's a great peace of mind thing to have. Okay, now, this is a really good example of what happens if something goes wrong with the battery. So This is not necessarily for one specific person, but in general, if there's an issue with like the battery for that car. So the Chevy Bolt had a battery recall that was issued in 2021, and it was due to a manufacturing risk that caused fire risk. Now, this is separate from the warranties we just talked about because this is a manufacturer problem. The battery replacements are underway and actually almost done. They're totally free and they are under warranty, but even if you didn't have a warranty, they would do it. So this affects owners from 2017 to 2019 that had to get the battery replacements. It took some time, but a benefit to this actually was that when you got the new battery packs in, it actually increased the range because the technology had gotten better already. So they had now a 259-mile range. What is important to note that the fire risks do remain lower for EVs and gas-powered cars, but things like this will happen. So just be aware. Won't happen like a lot, but just it might happen every now and again. I'm going to take another water break and look and see if there's any more questions. Okay. This one is, does range decline whether the car is driven or not, i.e., is battery decline associated with use time or both? Their municipality has a 2016 Nissan Leaf that only has 4,000 miles on it because staff only drive it occasionally and mostly around town, and also seldom charge it because we don't need to. What I would say is probably not, but you want to keep it at a certain level of charge. So you want to keep it between 20 to 80% of charge so the battery doesn't degrade. That's just where the battery is naturally happiest. So I wouldn't leave it on 0, and I also wouldn't leave it at like 100% either because it's just not good for the battery. But if it's not driven around a lot, shouldn't be a problem as long as it's kept at a decent level of charge. Does the battery warranty transfer to me when I buy a pre-owned vehicle? Usually it does, yes. Okay, this person has a random question. I tried to take my car to Worcester on a full charge of 103 miles. My destination was 80 miles away, and I barely made it. Range was so low that it was flashing me when I got there. I charged it to 89 miles during the event, but then on the way home, I had 29 miles left. What gives? So range depends on a lot of different factors. It could be that like on the way there was a lot of uphill driving. On the way back, there was a lot of downhill driving. It could be that the temperature was different from like the time you went there in the morning. You may have been colder. So you've been using your heat versus like on the way back, it was warmer, maybe not using your heat so much. There's a lot of different factors. Something that kind of shows you that is if you're going on a trip, if you use a better route planner, it's an app. You can also use it on the web. And it tells you like it factors in the weather and temperatures, and it factors in like if you have extra weight in your car, which can change the efficiency as well, and all other different factors that can change your efficiency. So unfortunately, I have more questions about that, like your specific situation, so I can't fully answer it, but those are, some of my little tidbits. Okay, someone says that their 2019 Kona EV recommends driving it at least once every 4 months. I really hope that that municipality is doing that, if not more, because why have a car if you're not going to use it? Okay, we're going to carry on with the presentation and then we'll have more time for questions later. Now we're going to talk about tips for buying a pre-owned vehicle. I'll just apologize in advance. I could not find any newer graphs that showed better data, but I did still want to show you the breakout of different cars. So generally speaking, the older the car, the more inexpensive it is, but the lower the range it could have, because that's, it came out when it had a low range, but also because of the degradation over time. And it's going to be harder to find. So really, I would suggest staying away from anything like 2014, 2015 or earlier. After those dates, so like 2015, 2016, you have better value. It's kind of in the middle range. It might be a little bit harder to find than some of the newer models, but it's still pretty good, especially depending upon the car that you get or that you're looking into. 2017, 2018, 2019, and even to like up to 2022, those are going to be the pricier cars, even though that they're used, but they will have higher ranges, which is really great. And so you'll be able to get more out of the car, and you're going to have a lot more options. So even just a few years ago, you can see back in 2011, there were only 2 car models to choose from, and now you can see there's tons more, and there's even more on the way. So this will be even higher, have even more colors than in like 2022 than in 2019. So there are a lot of really great options out there. However, it is still a smaller market than your traditional car buying market is, because right now EVs make up just 5.8% of the new car market. So you can imagine those secondhand markets don't have as much as a gas-powered market does. So you'll still have to do a little bit of digging. And now I just want to show you a comparison of kind of a little bit of what I just talked about. So, those cars that are quite a bit older, what their range looks like, what their prices look like versus newer cars. So if you start on the left-hand side, you'll see that the 2012 Nissan Leaf only got about 84 miles of range. It was really, really low. And the price is roughly $6,000. And again, most these prices I took from Kelley Blue Book. In 2016, range gets a little bit better, still not amazing. And so that's going to be less now than it was then, and it's going to be about $8,000. For the 2018, it's about $16,500. You get 151 miles, so again, a great increase in range. And then for the 2019, it's 226 miles for the Nissan Leaf Plus, and that's 16,500 roughly. That's about where the newest Nissan Leaf lives too. It's about 226 miles of range. So just know the newer the car, generally speaking, the larger the range or the greater the range. That's not to say some of these don't make really great cars. It really just depends upon what your needs are and things like that. There are plenty of cars on the market that still have really fantastic ranges but are a few years old. So it is all doable. And we'll just talk about some popular pre-owned all-electric vehicles. Again, the Nissan Leaf example can be a little bit complicated because there's a regular Nissan Leaf with the smaller battery pack. It's about 149 to 151 all-electric miles of range, depending on the source you look at. And the Nissan Leaf Plus gets 226 miles of range. But the prices I have here are based on the regular Nissan Leaf, not the Plus. So the average price of a used Nissan Leaf is anywhere from about $19,000 to almost $23,000. So that's 2020 used Nissan Leaf. For a 2023 model version, that can be anywhere from about $27,700 to about $28,600. So definitely a savings to be had, especially if you get the regular Nissan. And then the Hyundai Kona, we took a 2019 as an example. This car is really great because it shows you a used car that has a greater range. So it's 258 miles of all electric range. The Kona is traditionally a little bit pricier, especially if you compare it to the gas version of it. The Hyundai Kona started at around $40,000 when it came out, and now it's slowly gotten down to price. You'll see it's about $34,000 for a new one. But for a used one, it's about $22,000, and then to $25,000. So there's still some savings to be had, and you still get that really great range. Excuse me. For the 2020 Chevy Bolt, again, you have 259 miles, all electricity. It's really great. For a used one, you'll pay about $20,000 to about $22,000, and for a new one, it's $26,000 to about $27,000. Excuse me. I will note again that we are not factoring in the state or the federal incentives here, so factor those in as well. So we've talked a lot about all electric used cars, so I kind of wanted to have a spotlight for the pre-owned market. One really great plug-in hybrid, unfortunately they stopped making it a few years ago, is the Chevy Volt. That you got anywhere from 30 to 50 miles of electricity depending on the year that you bought it, and it had then a full gas tank to back it up. The average price for a vehicle, for one of these vehicles, is anywhere from about $8,000 to about $23,000. So I'm assuming that'll be for like 2019 model years. Still a really, really great option for people who just want to dip their toes into the electric vehicle world. And then we have the 2017 Toyota Prius Prime. Another great option. It has 25 miles of electric range and then gas backup. It's a little bit pricier. It goes from anywhere from $21,000 to about $24,000. The 2023 model year hasn't been announced yet, so I can't put the comparison prices there. So stay tuned for that. Obviously, I can't put the comparison prices for the Volt or the Toyota Prius plug-in hybrid because they don't make newer versions of those. The Toyota Prius plug-in hybrid became the Prius Prime. But the Prius plug-in hybrid from 2012 to 2015 has 11 miles of electric range and then gas backup. And that is a really affordable car, anywhere from $12,000 to about $17,000. So there are really great options out there for used vehicles, especially for plug-in hybrids and for all electric vehicles alike. There's just, there's a car out there for everybody. However, I don't want to lie to you. Car shopping is going to be a little bit difficult because there is still a supply crunch in effect. So used car prices fell 3.3% from November 2021 to November of last year, but they have started to rise again as of this month. And from what I've read, they're going to continue to rise a little bit for some time, but this is like the normal time for them to rise because it's tax season. Excuse me. Another thing, something to note though, is that the federal tax credit is up to $4,000, but there are qualifiers that we talked about. You can get that Rhode Island state rebate, but not in Massachusetts quite yet, so fingers crossed that gets announced soon. New EVs are low in inventory, which means there's more demand again for used EVs, so it may take some time for you to find the perfect car for you. And then, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say that you should check out our website. There's a Drive Green shopping tool, both for new and used EVs, where you can compare all the important bits of information that you want. So it looks like this. In the interest of time, I'm not going to show it to you because we only have about 10 minutes left, and I'm sure you all have lots of questions. But basically, when you go on this portal, each car has its own card where it compares all the different facts you want to know about the car. So it compares range, drivetrain, what the price points you should pay for these cars are. The used car portal is separate from the new car portal because we're not offering you a way to liaise with dealerships. With the used car portal, it's more of a way to compare what types of cars you're looking for. We also group them by model years. The model years are grouped by if they have the same range or not. So you look in there and you can filter it based on if you want to plug in a hybrid or a battery electric vehicle and what price points you're looking for and things of that nature. So it's a really great tool if you're just thinking about an EV and wanting to see what kinds of models you can expect to be out there and what kinds of price points you can expect to pay. So this is my contact information. So if any of you want to reach out, feel free to do so. You can also just reply to the email that I'll send around probably tomorrow with all of this information. Before I take any further questions, I just want to say if you've enjoyed this presentation or otherwise enjoyed any of the work that we've done, please consider donating. Donations will be doubled dollar for dollar during the month of March. So please definitely consider donating to Green Energy Consumers. I'll switch back to this slide, but I will see what other questions we have in store. Okay, so this one says, my 2015 Chevy Volt with a V as in Victor, with a gasoline-powered generator, owner's manual suggests that we keep it plugged in so that the electric current can keep the battery temperature at the optimal level. How does this relate to your suggestion to keep the battery level below 100%? Any opinion? So as far as that is, my first thought is that relates to like winter driving. So when the battery is cold, it doesn't perform as well. And so you want to keep it plugged in to a certain extent to precondition the vehicle before you drive it, so you lose less range. For plug-in hybrids, it's a little bit different of a situation than your battery electric vehicle, because even if the electric range does degrade or decrease, it's not as much of a factor because you do have that gasoline backup. And so maybe that's why they're telling you to keep it plugged in all the time, because they're not so worried about that. But I'm not sure of the intentions behind that, to be honest with you. I think you should follow the owner's manual. I think it'll be fine. But again, Volts only have about, I actually don't know what the 2015 does, but I do know a 2017 Volt has about 53 miles of range. So it shouldn't be too bad. So this question is Consumer Reports a good resource for EVs in general and used EVs also? Or are there sites that are better informed? We use Consumer Reports quite a bit. We do rely on them for a good source of information. They end up backing up information that we've already been telling folks. Union of Concerned Scientists is also a really great place to look. And then you can also just look to us too. We write a lot of blogs and we have a lot of really great information on the Learn More part of our website. So anything you really want to know about EVs in general. This question is, do you plug-in hybrids switch back and forth between electric and gas depending on which is most efficient at that moment, or do they use up the electric range all at the beginning and then switch to gas? Weirdly, that answer is both. It depends on the car. So some cars are designed to switch back and forth, and some cars are designed to just use all of the electric energy first. So this one is, some of the Drive Green contracts with dealerships have expired. That is very true. Is it worth waiting for them to be updated, or does that generally take many months? So this is an ongoing problem we have had. So we have, like I've talked about earlier, there has been a crazy supply shortage, which means that dealerships aren't having cars on their lots, which means they're not offering discounts, which dealerships used to do on our website. And some are opting to not partner with us at all anymore because they don't see the need to do so, even though we do have a lot of great leads for them. So I would not wait. If you have a question about a specific dealership, I would recommend that you contact me and I can answer your question more fully and we can talk about it. But dealerships are slow to update things sometimes. But we do have other dealerships that are really great and really involved, but it really just depends. So unfortunately, that's not the best answer for you, but I would say go with whatever dealership you're happy with. And if you want to follow up with me, please do so. I really encourage that we can talk more specifically about your question. This question is, how do you get state of health on used cars? So I talked to the folks at Recurrent Auto a few months ago, and they have done a ton of research. They have a lot of folks with, what do they get? They get these little, my coworker calls them like little doodads, but they put this, like, insert this thing into your car, so they get all of this information. And so from all the data points they've gathered over time, they can guesstimate what that car's health is going to look like. But I would really encourage you to check out their website because they do a really great job. And then if you're considering looking at specific vehicles for like winter driving and decrease in range, they do an awesome job at that too. Because I can tend to tell you generally what that will look like, but on a specific car, it's a lot more research intensive. This is a really good point. So I have a Leaf and its range is terrible. It's less than 90 miles. However, I did an analysis of my usage before buying it. It is absolutely fine for 95% of my trips. I would recommend anyone considering a used EV to do a realistic analysis of how many miles they actually drive per day, not just what they think they might drive. Most people have 2 cars anyways, and the Leaf has saved me a ton on gas, and I only have to use my secondary car. Hold on. Sorry, the quote got too long and it cut me off. Oh, I only have to use my secondary car occasionally, plus I love it. So I feel like that's a really, thank you, John. I feel like that's a really good quote to end this on. I really hope that you all appreciated this webinar and learned a lot. I appreciate all your questions and that you're being so active in the chat. I will follow up with you in the coming days, and I hope to see you at future webinars. Thank you, everybody.
All righty, so we are 1 minute past the hour, so I think I'm going to jump in and start here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are thrilled to see this big and diverse group joining us to discuss HVAC choices for student health and learning. And thank you all for spending this hour with us. It is definitely going to be jam-packed. Before we jump into the webinar, I wanted to start with a couple of announcements for you. First, please be aware that the audience will stay muted throughout the webinar to avoid any mishaps. But that being said, we would love to hear from you during the webinar. Please type any questions that you might have into the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can leave questions for us at any point during the webinar, and we'll hold them to answer until the end. And then lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording by email when it is ready. Next slide. So my name is Emma Hines, and I'll be one of your moderators today. I am speaking to you on behalf of RMI, formerly Rocky Mountain Institute. We are a nonprofit organization working to accelerate the clean energy transition. And I work on a really unique team here focused on the health benefits of transitioning away from fossil fuels in our buildings. And I'll pass to my partner, Sarah Ross, for a quick introduction now too.
Great, thanks, Emma. My name is Sarah Ross. I'm a co-founder at Undaunted K-12. Undaunted is a national nonprofit with a mission to support America's K-12 public schools to make an equitable transition to zero carbon emissions while also preparing young people to build sustainable futures in rapidly changing climate. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Sarah. And we are also very lucky to be joined by 3 speakers today. Each will introduce themselves in a little bit more detail, but as a quick overview for you all, our speakers today are Dr. Erica Etland from Perkins & Will, Wyatt Ross from CMTA, and Julia Casagrande from the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Next slide. So before I pass to each of our speakers who are going to present on pretty distinct subject matter, part of my role here today is to provide some introductory remarks and a little bit of context to help construct a cohesive narrative between the three. So to make sure that we're all on the same page and have a basic understanding, when we talk about HVAC systems or HVAC, we're talking about the heating, cooling, and ventilation equipment that's used to keep the air in our buildings a comfortable temperature and humidity and clean from any pollution or viruses. And there are three big motivators behind this webinar, and these have also underpinned Sarah and I's work on this for the past year and brought us together in the first place. So to walk through those, the first motivator is increased attention. So you probably all know that we are now officially 3 years out from the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And if there's one thing that has been reinforced yet again, it's this critical role that HVAC equipment plays in schools for disease mitigation and how school leaders can select the best equipment for that and beyond. The next motivator is increased need. So COVID is obviously still a great example of this, but to pull another one, we've also been seeing the impacts of school closures and lost learning time from extreme heat, especially in schools lacking cooling. And this is going to continue to be a problem here in the US, demonstrating a really clear need for all schools to have adequate cooling in place. And then finally, the third motivator for us being here today is increased funding. So we're recognizing that we're in this moment where that increased attention and increased need are being met with a new funding landscape with more than one source of funds like the Inflation Reduction Act and ESSER funds as well. And this is allowing states and jurisdictions and school districts to invest in their HVAC systems, making it important that we get those investments right. Next slide. So over the past year, Sarah and I have worked to solidify our thinking on this topic and to also make something of our desire to educate and advocate for cleaner and healthier schools. So we did what most folks do, and we wrote a report, and it was published back in January. So we're using this webinar to uplift its messages again, but also the voices of our three expert guests today. There's one more nugget from this report, though, that carries over into the naming and framing of our webinar here today, which is the title of having choices when it comes to our HVAC systems in schools. So we set up a framework in the report of legacy and modern HVAC equipment. And it's important that we communicate with you all here the distinctions between these two, because you're going to hear us and our speakers talk about the importance of transitioning from that legacy to modern equipment. Next slide. So let's start with legacy HVAC equipment. These systems rely on burning fossil fuels. That can be things like gas, oil, or propane, and they're burned on site in our school buildings to make heat, which is a relatively inefficient process. Some common examples in the school environment are systems like boilers and central packaged units. They may or may not be supplemented with air conditioning, and many don't accommodate advanced ventilation and filtration. It's also really important to note that when we say legacy, that we're not necessarily talking about the age of the equipment, but more so about the approach to making heat. So a brand new gas boiler is still in this legacy camp because it uses this outdated and inefficient approach to keeping buildings comfortable. Next slide. On the other hand, though, modern systems, instead of making heat, they move heat that already exists in the air or in the ground. And by using this approach of moving heat, we can both heat and cool our indoor spaces with just one really cool piece of equipment, and that's called a heat pump. This approach doesn't involve combustion of fossil fuels. It can be powered with clean, renewable energy, and it's vastly more efficient than burning fossil fuels, and it does a better job of ventilation and filtration. This transition to modern equipment is already happening in leading schools today, which you'll hear about in a little bit, and it really is the future for all schools. Next slide. So I'll wrap up this background by sharing that there are 3 key messages that we want to deliver in today's webinar, and each of our guests will speak on a portion of these messages. So the first big one is that transitioning to modern HVAC systems is critical to student health and learning. Our second message is that over the past few years, and especially now with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, that the economics are changing in favor of all electric and high performance HVAC options. And then third, which is really exciting, is that we already have fantastic examples of how states and jurisdictions and school districts are taking action on this transition. So now, with all of that background in mind, it is my pleasure to hand the mic over to our first speaker, Dr. Erica Etland, who is a true expert in connecting building quality to student health and performance. And she is going to dive deeper into this first key message for us. So take it away from here, Erica.
Awesome. Thank you, Emma. Hi, everybody. I get to be sort of today's hype woman, I think, so my name is Dr. Erica Etland, and I'm the director of the Human Experience Lab here at Perkins and Will. And much of my research is focused on how K-12 buildings impact child's health and really what do we do about it. So to kick us off today, I'm going to go into 2 critical questions. First, the why now and why HVAC. So we're going to get into it. So the first piece here is that this is not new. And this discussion of ventilation in K-12 is not really something we have ever left in our sort of discussion. You know, it dates back to reducing tuberculosis infections in the early 20th century. And yet, what's interesting to me when I look at these images from almost 100 years ago, we weren't able to radically change the way that we responded to this last pandemic. We had outdoor classrooms, we opened windows. And so on the next slide, it highlights the fact that this is, our buildings need to be thinking about this radically, and that as we modernize our K-12 buildings, that this isn't just sort of improving air quality for a pandemic, it's even looking right before. So if we think about 2019, we had a measles outbreak that spread through coughing and sneezing. This impacted 22 states at the highest level since 1992. Then we see that this is an equity issue. And so we're also recognizing that there's just persistent inequities when we think about asthma, which is one of the largest determinants of chronic absenteeism. And then we just have seasonal issues like, seasonal flu that is impacting 18 states also in 2019. So as I go through this and I think about, well, why now? On the next slide, it's really about getting into the data. And so we have growing evidence that our K-12 facilities are in need of replacement or repairs. And, if we look at this 2020 congressional report, what we see is that 54% of public school districts needed to update or replace multiple building systems, but 41% of school districts needed significant HVAC system updates. And so this is equivalent to 36,000 schools nationwide. So this is a really important time for us to think about, well, what is this evidence and what do we do about it? So next, let's get into the sort of why now from a human side. We all fall into the trap of maybe prioritizing the building, but it really comes down to people. And so when we think about improving our students' environmental quality, it's going to have lasting impact on their growth and development. So every decision we make now actually helps when we think about the fact that by the time our students graduate 12th grade, they've spent 15,000 hours in their school building, their lungs have continued to develop and sort of function in a certain way. We know that kids are breathing 50% more air. And so all of these aspects are leading to sort of an increased susceptibility that we need to be thinking about. This isn't just an office building. This is really something where the people who occupy this space make this an important priority. And so on the next slide, we talked about, well, what is that growing evidence and research? Well, back in 2017, with the Healthy Buildings team at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, we started to dive into what were the 9 foundations of a healthy building. And what we found was ventilation, air quality, thermal health, dust pests, all are having radical impacts on our child and teacher health. And so this was sort of an early framework for us to think about. And I would say through the pandemic, we've had the ability to maybe expand it to other social and emotional, holistic health perspectives. But for today, I want us to just get into this. So next slide, we see that we have this incredible report that kind of does all the synthesis for you. So if you're enthusiastic about acoustics, by all means, knock yourself out. But we found out that what was really important is that there's this incredible body of research that goes beyond even our RMI report, but allows us to really understand what happens if we don't make these health-based decisions. So basically, on the next slide, what we see is that there was a central thesis of this document, which was that health is actually foundational to student thinking and performance. So for every day that a child is in a classroom that's too hot, too stuffy, there's direct impacts on their ability to focus, to be attentive. And so at the end of an academic year, what are you really measuring? Are you measuring sort of their actual ability, or is it sort of being influenced by the student's environmental conditions that are impacting those test scores? So this is sort of why this is relevant, but I want us to get into why HVAC specifically. So if we get into this, what we see is that there's actually lots of sources of these indoor air quality pollutants, and it's everything from the furniture and what chemicals are in our products. So if we think real micro, thinking about viral particles like, seasonal flu or COVID, we also bring in other, common pollutants. This can be things like our adhesives, our supplies, and then it gets into stuff that is driven by our building. So it could be our school occupants, so the building as itself. So thinking about on-site combustion, when we think about some of that legacy HVAC aspect to it, we also see that some of our past building materials have migrated into the dust, creating this legacy pollutant situation that we need to be thinking about. We have seasonal pollutants, things like allergens, pollen, even just wildfires that we know can track across the United States. And then even the siting of the building. Is it located close to traffic, major airports, other sort of waste sites as well? So these are just important factors for us to be considering of, okay, there's the soup around us, and how are we going to respond? And that's on our next slide, is really thinking about ventilation and filtration as a true spectrum. So there's three main goals of ventilation. One is to just control and remove some of those airborne pollutants. The second is to dilute indoor air with fresh or clean air. And that's the assumption that the outdoor air is cleaner than our indoor air. And then the third is managing temperature and humidity. So these are opportunities for us to think that it's not, well, do you have ventilation? There's lots of, nuance in that conversation that we'll get into today. But again, focused on health, if I think about the next slide, what we see here is that, again, that foundational piece. We know that when we underventilate our classrooms, we have increases in viral infections, increase of wheeze, sick building syndrome symptoms, even just satisfaction decreases. And with that comes, decrements in attention, comprehension, concentration. So no wonder then we see that there's impacts on our standardized tests. And I love this study on the next slide, which is just basically saying that a poorly ventilated classroom is equivalent to a student skipping breakfast. And yet we have universal breakfast, programs across the US to fill that need because we know it's important. And so to me, some of this work really gets down to an equity piece. So if I look at the next slide, what we see is that African American and Hispanic students, as well as free and reduced lunch students, are experiencing high levels of indoor temperature. So this isn't just about sort of the pollutant side, it's also about the temperature that they're taking their tests. And so what we find is that they're compared to their white Caucasian counterparts or their more affluent counterparts who are typically in that optimal temperature for test performance, we see that there's this discrepancy. So when we talk about HVAC, it's really also an equity piece. And so to kind of nerd out a little bit more on thermal comfort, on the next slide, one thing I would like us to sort of start thinking about, and this was really critical in the Healthy Buildings work at Harvard with Joe Allen, was really shifting our conversation around thermal comfort, which is really just a subjective measure of, how hot are you in this space? Are you comfortable in this environment? And really acknowledging that children have higher baseline metabolic rates, they have higher core body temperatures, their ability to acclimatize is not the same. And so when we even think about, how some of these standards were created, like ASHRAE 55, we find that, they're not maybe meeting the needs of a very sort of active third grade class, perhaps, and that they were based on sort of men in three-piece suits. So we have to sort of shift our thinking to something around thermal health. And so this is an assessment that's bringing in some of those personal factors, clothing and metabolic rate and physical activity. So on the next slide, we're jumping into the fact that, we see that there's this U-shaped relationship, that there's also cold stress as well as heat stress. And so being able to provide both heating and cooling in our buildings is critical, because when we see that we kind of go to those either extremes, there's impacts on, our memory, our reasoning, and our skills that make us sort of more susceptible, and especially young students. And to me, on the next slide is really when we think about it in the context of climate, that there's this important piece here, which is that in a study of 75,000 students, they found that students taking an exam on a 90-degree day versus a 75-degree day were 12% more likely to fail that exam. And so this is equivalent to the Black-White achievement gap. So we have a real important focus here, where if we think about the average life of a school building, how many 90-degree days are in our future? And so with that, I want us to kind of get into the action. And so that is it for me. So thanks so much. On the next slide is just my contact info and some other resources. And we get into indoor air quality a lot more in depth on a podcast called Inhabit, which is a Perkins and Will production. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Erica, for giving us an all too quick dip into this really deep body of research that connects the built environment with our human health. So now we're going to hear from Wyatt Ross. Wyatt is an energy and sustainability engineer with CMTA. CMTA is recognized as a national leader for delivering high-performance sustainable projects. Their portfolio includes the first net zero school in the country, Richardsville Elementary in Kentucky, over a decade ago. It also includes more recently the first, as far as I know, net zero school retrofit, Buckley Elementary in Connecticut. And it includes the first building to combine WELL certification and net zero, which happens to be CMT's very own headquarters in Louisville. So Wyatt, thank you so much for being with us here today in Brian's stead. Where should we start?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So happy to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. So in addition, to talking about the health benefits and performance ramifications of our HVAC systems, we also want to talk about the environmental impacts that our HVAC systems can have in our schools. And so today I want to talk a little bit about what these modern systems look like in juxtaposition to kind of this legacy equipment that we're talking about, and what that means from an emission standpoint from our buildings, and then also what are some tools and some recent legislation that we can leverage to help achieve and implement and deploy these systems. So if you jump to the next slide. So with these modern systems, kind of a core concept that we're looking at here is the concept of electrification. And so when we're talking about electrification, what that means is it's the switching of utilizing combustion on site in our buildings to generate heat as it relates to HVAC, and switching to systems or technologies that are fully electric. And the reasoning behind this is that when we switch our buildings to utilizing systems that are electric, eventually we can depend on renewable energy such as solar, nuclear, wind, hydro, to generate that electricity. And the benefit that has, not only at the building level, but at the global level, is that transition will allow us to use less greenhouse gas intensive fuel sources that you see here on this slide. And it also will decrease the amount of air pollution that we're seeing both at the building level and our local community level, and also at the global scale. So if you jump to the next slide. For the most part, when we're talking about the fuel sources that we're utilizing for generating heat in our buildings, whether it be boilers or packaged rooftop equipment, we're typically talking about natural gas. And so what you can see in that purple bar there is when we combust this gas, it has a significant greenhouse gas impact, which contributes to climate change. And then in addition to combusting that natural gas, there's also what we call fugitive emissions, which are associated with the leakage of natural gas as it's distributed to your building. And so if we can remove these systems or the use of these fuels from our buildings, we can make a tremendous impact on reducing our overall carbon impact. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about legacy versus modern equipment. There's kind of 2 points that I want to make. And so when we're talking about legacy equipment, to Emma's point, these aren't necessarily old pieces of equipment in our buildings. It's more so that it's technology that is more traditional. It's been around, and it's not going to meet the needs of our schools in the future. And so we're talking about, hot water boilers, steam boilers, things that can't achieve the efficiency levels of some of the modern equipment that we're talking about. But it also could be electric heat, which is, resistant heat, similar to getting hot when you touch a light bulb, only going to achieve an efficiency of around 99%. The other downside of these legacy equipment, pieces of equipment, is that they can only generate heat. And we're coming into a world which will more and more so require cooling. And so this modern equipment, which we can more broadly classify as heat pump technology, has a couple of benefits. One, it's extremely more efficient, as you can see, 200 to 700% efficient, because it relies on moving heat rather than generating heat. And then the second benefit is that they can also simultaneously provide cooling. So they're more of a dual purpose technology. Next slide. And so when we look at comparing these technologies from an operational emission standpoint, because you're probably wondering, just because I electrify, where is that electricity coming from? There's still emissions associated with it. So what this is looking at is if we take a sample school in a region that has currently a fairly dirty grid, somewhere where that's using mostly coal-fired power plants to generate electricity, and we look at switching between a natural gas boiler that's generating heat at the building versus an electric heat pump, what are the total emissions of those two systems, including the emissions from electricity? And so what we see is over time, over a 30-year period, as we expect our grid to deploy more and more renewable energy and become cleaner over time, by the end of those two systems' life, a school that deployed electric heat pumps can expect to reduce emissions by almost 80% compared to a school that chose to use a natural gas boiler starting today. And so this just kind of gives you the sense of scale of the greenhouse gas emissions of an electrified new technology HVAC system can save. Next slide. So all that said, you still have to pay for these systems. And so how do we do that? And so, I think it's really important to be aware of the recent legislation that has passed. I'm sure most people have heard about the Inflation Reduction Act at this point. There's kind of two big things that I want you to take away from the slide, and then you can use the rest as a text as a reference. But the big thing is that before, in the recent past, these tax credits have been available in some form or another, or they have existed, but they have not been available to public K-12 schools. And so that has changed with this legislation. And so now there are incentives available that can help cover the cost or any premium associated with these modern technology. And then the other big change is that for some of these technologies, the tax credit base has increased from 10% in the case of geothermal heat pumps up to 30%. And there's additional incentives that can potentially raise that. And so what that means is that not only can these heat pumps to modern technologies meet a lot of the technical needs of heating and cooling, but they can also meet some of the financial needs that districts are facing. Next slide. So again, we won't go into all of the technologies that are covered by this bill, but really the big one for our conversation today is ground source heat pumps. Also solar photovoltaics are covered, battery storage, some microgrid technology, and a whole slew of other technologies that we won't have time to get into. Next slide. And so just real quickly, I wanted to jump into, kind of a case study. This is a school that Sarah mentioned that we worked on in Connecticut, net zero energy renovation. It did not leverage the tax credits, but this is kind of a case study to prove out what it would have looked like if they had, how beneficial that could have been. And so this is a life cycle study over life cycle cost analysis over 25 years. And you can see if we just compared to a code minimum system that we could have deployed, it would have cost roughly $13 million over the course of that system's life to own and operate. And so if we compare that to the geothermal system that they went with on the next slide, you can see that we were able to provide them with a system that had almost a $3 million savings over the course of the system's life. The only downside is that it did have a small premium associated with going with that HVAC solution, and that was going to result in a 6-year payback. So if we jump to what these new tax credits could have done for the financial story of the system, is that it would have resulted in a 34% tax credit that could have covered 34% of the total cost of the entire HVAC line item associated with the system, and reduced the 6-year payback to 1 year. So almost an immediate return on investment, and saved $5 million over the course of the system's life for that district. And so the key takeaway here is that with these tax credits, one, before the tax credit, this HVAC system still made a lot of sense and had a lot of merit for all the health reasons that Emma was talking about, or sorry, Erica was talking about, as well as the energy savings associated with the system. But with the tax credits, it almost becomes this no-brainer, first cost, best option, and then all of those ancillary benefits as well. And so this just shows the magnitude of impact these credits could have for looking at these options. Next slide. So quick, sustainability playbook here. How do we actually go about achieving and implementing these systems? And so when you have a project come online where you're looking to maybe do an HVAC retrofit or new construction or whatever it may be, kind of step one is that we really need to make sure that we're asking for the right qualified people that can design and deliver these systems. And so including language in our RFPs that talk about performance outcomes, whether it be the health and wellness outcomes, the energy savings, the system types. If you're asking the right questions in the RFP, you'll bring people to the table that can deliver those solutions. The second thing is during design, design of any school can be messy. And so you have to have advocates both on the design team side with the architect, the engineers, structural contractors, and on the school district side that can continue to ask the right questions, make sure that we're talking about the right things and that we're focused on achieving those objectives that we talked about today. The third thing, and this one's really important, as we transition to more and more modern systems and away from traditional systems where contractors and estimators are more familiar, that transition can be a little bit of a pain period. And so estimators, if they aren't super familiar with these new systems, you might see them put in some buffer or safety factors associated with the cost of these new systems. And that can kind of inherently price out these systems, maybe unintentionally. And so what we want to do is make sure that we're getting early pricing sets that are very detailed, kind of dig into the weeds and make sure that we're getting the right information so that we're not making any assumptions that might be wrong and falsely price out systems that we would like to keep. So the last step is then managing costs. And so I said it before, Buckley was able to achieve the geothermal HVAC system with a dedicated ventilation system and all these additional benefits before these ITC tax credits through the Inflation Reduction Act. So there are ways to keep projects within budget as long as you're prioritizing the right things. So if we're aware of what the goals and the systems that we can deploy, we can prioritize those in and almost always make it work. And then on top of that, we now have these new financial resources and incentives that can kind of be icing on top to make these more feasible. And that's it for me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Wyatt. So now that we've heard from Erica about the importance of HVAC systems in schools and Wyatt about electrification and how the Inflation Reduction Act is reimagining the funding landscape for all electric retrofits, I am really pleased to pass the mic to Julia Casagrande, who will be giving us a behind the scenes look at New York City's recent and powerful commitment to electrifying schools. So take it away from here, Julia.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Emma. And it's great to have all of that information from Erica and Wyatt. I'm excited to dive into how New York City is working to electrify our schools and how we're navigating the different laws and priorities that we have in this space. So about me, my name is Julia Casagrande. I'm a policy advisor at the mayor's office. I work on researching and developing policy for New York City in the building decarbonization space and in the climate retrofit space. We've worked on developing policy like Local Law 154, our all electric new buildings law, and our clean construction executive order. But I also work on coordinating and advising city agencies that are doing decarbonization work, particularly when there are multiple agencies involved. And that's what I'm going to get into today on the school electrification front. So next slide. I was just going to give a little background on the New York City school system. We have over 1,400 school buildings in the city, and that's the largest school district in the country, and then also the largest contributor to municipal energy use within the city. So this chart on the right shows that K-12 schools are 32% of our municipal energy use, and it's also our largest source of municipal greenhouse gas emissions. I would note these buildings are old. We're talking about legacy systems that may or may not be new. In this case, they are largely very old boilers. We have old electrical systems. We have old envelopes. We have a lot of historic buildings that are 100 years old and they are registered historic sites. So it's complicated to retrofit these buildings. That being said, our school construction authority and our Department of Education have been doing a lot to reduce the emissions of our buildings. As of 2007, we have all our new buildings following Green Schools Guide, which is the New York City schools specific version of LEED compliance. And we have about 10 to 15 new schools that are built each year and have been following this since 2007. Obviously, it's been updated a lot of times since then. We also have a lot of efficiency work that's been going on. So across the portfolio, the municipal portfolio, the city has reduced emissions by 26%. And then there's a lot of innovative work with green roofs. We have a net zero school in Staten Island, PS62R, increasing amounts of solar, etc. But there's still a lot of work to do in this space. A lot of the improvements to date have been from like fuel switching and the electrical grid cleaning up, and there's a lot of work to do. So what I was going to highlight is we have 200 schools remaining, about 200 schools remaining that are burning number 4 heating oil and emit very relatively high amounts of air pollution. So that's sort of the universe that we're focusing on for this electrification initiative, and I'll go into that more on the next slide. So in the landscape, there's also some competing laws and priorities that are relevant to the policy decisions that we came up with. Fuel oil 4, I don't know, depending on where folks live, may or may not use this fuel, but it's a heavy residual fuel oil and it emits high amounts of air pollution. The phase out of fuel oil 4 was required by 2030. When we set this policy, we actually just last month passed a law that's accelerating this phase out, and now it's going to be required by 2025 for schools and 2027 for the private sector. We also have biofuel heating requirements, which are state mandates. There's city mandates, but then the state mandates are more stringent than city. So that's what we're following. We're going to be having to use 10% biodiesel by 2025 and 20% by 2030 in all of our heating oil. We also have Local Law 97, which is our building performance law, and there's requirements for private buildings, which gets more press, but we also have municipal operations requirements that are actually more stringent. We have to reduce our municipal portfolio emissions by 40% by 2025 and 50% by 2030, and that's from 2006 levels. The last law I would note is Local Law 154, which is our all-electric new buildings law. We have all schools will be electric by law as of January 5th, 2025, but they're already building all-electric schools at this point. I would just also note that there's all these laws that we have to comply with, and then there's also our priority, which is to make sure that we're focusing on improving air quality and delivering benefits to New Yorkers, particularly in neighborhoods with high asthma and those that have borne the brunt of environmental injustice in the past. So on the right here is a slide that shows the discrepancy of asthma emergency department visits from air pollution in New York City. So we have Northern Manhattan and the Bronx really, and then some in central Brooklyn really feeling the brunt of that. Next slide. Thank you. So with all of that in mind, we needed a plan to get our schools off of fuel oil number 4 and also to leapfrog to electrification to meet our decarbonization requirements. So we did not want to do any more replacement in kind, putting in new natural gas boilers that would replace fuel oil boilers. We definitely wanted to focus on electrification. However, we have 1,400 schools, so we couldn't electrify them all right away. So in the fall, Mayor Adams announced the Leading the Charge initiative, which is a $4 billion commitment to electrifying existing school buildings. And we have 100 schools that will be electrifying by 2030. You may remember from the earlier slide that we have 200 schools that are burning number 4 fuel oil. So what we decided to do was no new boilers. We are retrofitting the existing boilers to comply with the short-term regulations for to phase out number 4 fuel oil and have the biodiesel contents, and using our capital, our big dollars to install heat pumps. So we're doing an operation and maintenance retrofit on the existing boilers, get the quick air quality benefits at a much lower cost, and we're focusing the big dollars on our school electrification project. Also note that we're starting in communities. We prioritize communities with high asthma rates, as well as a heat vulnerability index and high truck traffic, which just adds more pollution to the area. Next slide. So I just wanted to speak a little about the collaborative strategy that we used to get to this agreement. Within the government, we have our Office of Management and Budget, who committed to not funding new boilers. So they really decided where the money was going to be going, and that's how we got the commitment for the electrification. Our School Construction Authority and Department of Education worked super closely together to figure out the technicality of these conversions. As I said, our buildings are really old. It's difficult to retrofit them. So these teams worked really closely together on the technical aspects. Our Department of Citywide Administrative Services oversees our portfolio of energy use for the city at large. So we worked with them, and then our office more on the policy and advising. We also we've had a lot of support for this initiative. Environmental justice groups, labor unions, and community groups have been advocating for school electrification way before this announcement was made. There was a Creating Green Healthy Schools initiative that was directed specifically at the mayor's office to implement changes such as this. Of course, there's more to do, and they continue to helpfully push us to go further. But largely, we've gotten a lot of support in this area, and I just put some screenshots of tweets there. On expected outcomes, we saw a huge air quality improvement from when we phased out number 6 heating oil, which was the prior phase out. This was completed by 2016. From that phase out, we see an annual reduction of 1,200 tons PM2.5 in the air around New York, and that prevents 210 approximately premature deaths annually. We expect this trend to be continued with the accelerated phase out of fuel oil number 4. And in prioritizing environmental justice areas for electrification, we want to make sure that these areas have the additional benefit. And we will see a reduction in air pollution and improved health, and keep New York City on the path to meet our climate mandates through leapfrogging to electrification. Just note, like, the city has a lot of power in where we spend our money, and we see this as a $4 billion market signal over 8 years towards electrification and decarbonization. So we're hoping this will help spur the market in New York City to have more contractors on board to do the work. And that's all I've got.
That was awesome. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Julie. The work that you all are doing in New York City is really nation leading, and we're so thrilled that you could share it with the audience today. We hope these panelists have inspired you all to think about what is possible in your own communities. After all, there is so much to be gained. You can read more about the 6 benefits of moving to all electric high performance systems in the paper. Our speakers touched on almost all of the benefits here today. And so right now, I'm going to assume that you're with us and that you are compelled and that you are ready to move to action. So let's go to the next slide. The report has a recommendation section at the end that is organized by role. So are you a state policymaker? Are you a school board member? Are you a parent? We've offered our thoughts on how you can champion the work from wherever you sit in the world. So please take a look at those recommendations. So I'm actually going to focus now on the potent moments for intervention that we cannot afford to miss. The first is new construction. New construction is one of those rare opportunities when we hold the responsibility of making good 50-year choices. So we really need to ensure that all new construction incorporates this modern HVAC technology. This can be a challenge, right? As Wyatt mentioned, there are contractors and some design partners that are frankly more comfortable with how they've been doing things, this legacy equipment, and change is hard. So if your community is building a new school, make sure your town leaders are clear on the importance and benefits of embracing these modern systems right from the start of the process. And make sure your design partners are also on board, or it will be very difficult to move in this direction. The second potent moment that we need to have our eyes peeled for is systems replacement. HVAC systems reach the end of their useful life and need to be replaced. The key here is to avoid what we call a like-for-like replacement. And instead, we need to make a break for this modern equipment. And again, here it's about establishing modern HVAC systems as the goal early on. We can't wait until systems fail to have the conversation. At that point, it's an emergency and we're destined for a like-for-like replacement. And the last opportunity is really about facilities planning. Our facilities plans that actually too few of our schools have need to reflect this desired transition from legacy systems to modern systems. These plans are sometimes called decarbonization plans when they absorb this lens. And our partners at New Buildings Institute have a great tool for that work that we will put into the chat for you all. Next slide. So with those 3 points of intervention in mind, we've all got work to do. And we've got 2 easy to digest one-pagers that you can use to open the conversation with leaders in your town. One is on the big ideas, right? A non-technical set of guideposts for really building understanding and therefore confidence in this area. And the second is a one-pager that recaps these 6 benefits of modern systems. So please use these as conversation openers. They are available on our website that we'll put again in the chat, so it's handy for you here. Next slide. And lastly, before we get to Q&A, I really want to recognize all of our wonderful supporting organizations. We have a stellar audience here today, largely because they helped us get the word out. And we are particularly appreciative of the organizations who contributed staff time. Our advisors, we had a wonderful set of advisors on this paper, our leading contributors in the field, and we are so grateful that they devoted time to improving our thinking and our writing on this topic. So a big shout out to ASHRAE, the Center for Green Schools, the Collaborative for High Performance Schools, CMTA, New Buildings Institute, Perkins and Will, and Stanford. So thank you so much. So it's time for your questions, and I'm going to exercise my moderator role here and ask the first one. So for each of our panelists, in 30 seconds, this is your short little sound bite. Tell us what is the most important thing that you want the audience to take away from your presentation. We're going to go in order. So Dr. Etland, Erica, you are up first.
Awesome. So, I think one thing that became really evident from the chat is that HVAC is a part of this, but it is not the whole solution. And I think we have to really be thinking about, especially when we're talking about equity, that we take sort of this look at the hierarchy of controls and where is HVAC a part of the solution, but recognizing that all buildings are not going to be able to kind of get to the Ferrari of HVAC systems, that we need to be able to sort of think about where does behavior change come in terms of energy conservation, where does it come in terms of reducing, asthma triggers. So I do think there's, just something that I feel very strongly about that's coming through the chat is that it's not just about outdoor air pollution, it's about the indoor. And I think that's where sort of the human behavior side complements some of these HVAC decisions. And then real quick, coming from an architecture firm, I think it's really important that you see yourselves as advocates to hold them accountable, to make sure that they're giving you the life cycle costs, that they're really trying to sort of work dynamically with people like CMTA and having the correct engineers on the job to make sure that they're providing sort of the full energy savings. Because I know there's some back and forth that health is, wow, we're talking about health first and not about energy. But I do think it's so often forgotten about what we're really trying to get to. And it is so foundational to sort of the main purpose of a school. So let's think holistically about all of this.
Great. Wyatt, that was Erica's 30 seconds, maybe. What's your 30 seconds?
Great. Yeah. So I guess two things. One, I think it's really important to take away from this conversation just how important HVAC systems are on the impacts of health, wellness, thermal comfort, thermal health, emissions, energy's cost savings. I think a lot of times HVAC can kind of be an afterthought when it comes to designing our schools. And so hopefully a takeaway is that, there's actually really important implications to what types of decisions we make as it relates to HVAC. And then, the second thing is there's a lot of things in the chat about consultants saying no. One of the things that I would like to say is, it's your building. You need to really push. If someone is telling you no, they probably have not done it before. These are not, bleeding edge technologies. These are things that have been around a long time. There are ways to make these solutions work almost always. And again, it's not going to happen designing in a vacuum. It does have to take into account energy efficiency, or else you're going to pay out the nose for a lot of heating and cooling you don't need. But if you can do envelopes right, if you can make other improvements to the building, you can make these things pencil out. And so you need to be it's your building, you're paying for it, and really leaning on your consultants to give what you're asking for is a key thing.
Awesome. I love it. Julia, your big takeaway for the audience here.
Sure. I would just say from our perspective in New York City, there's so much work to do. There's so much work being done all the time. And I think this project and this initiative has really highlighted that, like, when money is being spent, we need to make sure that it's being spent in the right areas. So putting the big dollars in electrification and then prioritizing where we're doing it so that we actually make sure we see the biggest improvement in air quality indoor and outdoor for the folks who have the biggest impacts of asthma. Yeah, that's what I say.
Great. Emma, I'm going to pass the baton over to you. Do you want to start us off with the next question from the audience?
Sure thing. So this first one is actually for Erica. So going back up to the top here. So we all know that you are a public health scientist and that you've been applying your expertise to K-12 school design for many years now. So this audience question was asking you to reflect on how often and whether the concepts of electrification and decarbonization more broadly come up in these conversations when we're talking solutions to the health and performance concerns that schools are facing. So from your experience, does electrification and decarbonization come up? If not, how do we bridge that gap?
I would say that we're at a point right now where those topics are coming up a lot more than health is. I would say that health is not as easily quantifiable as energy and cost savings. And so it's more of bridging our gap to be thinking about what are the health ramifications and what makes the most sense for our communities. I think this is something where we can talk about decarbonization, but it kind of gives me a little bit of like a back to the 70s where we had an energy crisis and we started removing all of our windows from our classrooms. And so we really have to be having sort of a holistic conversation about health. And that's why I really feel, and I appreciate sort of me getting to go first, in the sense that if we're going to have a conversation about decarbonization, we also have to be thinking about this in terms of climate adaptation and what are sort of the acute and short-term benefits of making some of these changes and investments, that it's not just a sort of a payout long-term down the line, but also things that, especially with schools across, New England and even to Cincinnati closing for extreme heat, we know those things will be felt pretty quickly. And it's an equity issue too. Who gets to have a decarbonization conversation is not for everybody. And so it is about how we're going to kind of lift all boats as we're talking about this.
Great. Why I've got a question for you, and it builds on some of what Erica was saying earlier too. So, when I think about districts that are building new schools right now, I mean, here I am on my high horse talking about how we can't miss this opportunity. And yet, as you know, probably better than anyone in this room, construction costs are really high, right? And community leaders are understandably sensitive to increasing tax bills. What would you say to a school building committee that is contemplating a gas boiler in new construction today as a response to those, very real, very challenging fiscal considerations? I mean, Erica talked about a Ferrari. Can we afford the Ferrari?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great question, and there's some legitimacy to that question, and there's also there are things happening that you can be wary of, so you can avoid ballooning costs that may be more figurative than literal. And so I would say first and foremost, I think there was a lot of great observations in the chat about energy conservation and other things that can be implemented into design so that you're right sizing HVAC systems. So you may not need the Tesla Cybertruck to get the job done. You might be able to get a Nissan Leaf or something of that nature, a more economy electrified system to meet your needs. And so first and foremost, when I talk about managing cost, I think that's a big part of it. Are your consultants, is your design team, are you as owners engaged in a conversation to figure out how to shift costs around so that you can make an economic decision? The second thing is the reality is that there is inflation in the construction market right now, and costs are ballooning, and being able in decades past where you really could almost always keep these systems within budget, that can be tougher to do right now, and there is a premium associated with these systems. And so leveraging the ITC, I can't emphasize that enough. These new tax credits that are available, you may not be able to go geothermal, and so your tax credit options may be limited. But if that's an option, if you have the land area, if you've minimized your loads enough to where you don't need as large of a well field as maybe what's for the standard construction, you can leverage those tax credits, and that can be in transformational as far as the financials of that project, making it the lowest first cost option. So I would make sure that you've explored all options if you're going down that route. The other thing that I would add is if you think about that 30-year time horizon that I said, where I showed a heat pump compared to a natural gas boiler. If you're putting in a boiler today, one thing that it's hard to quantify, but something to keep in the back of your mind is what will the regulation environment look like in 20 years, in 30 years? In 10 years. And so how could those regulations impact the cost of operating a boiler when you could have switched to electrified option and had more control over the pollution associated with that technology?
Thanks, Wyatt. So I think I'm going to jump in here and have us switch gears a little bit to talk about ventilation, since we've been heavy on the electrification side here. So Julia, if you'll join us for this question. The New York City commitment is very focused on electrification of space heating equipment, but as we've talked about today, ventilation is key to student health as well. So curious if you could give us a little bit of the details on how ventilation fits into this decarbonization plan, and how do you see electrification unlocking those complementary efforts on ventilation?
Yeah, of course. And there's a lot more detail of the actual retrofit plan than I could fit into 10 minutes. But the electrification projects absolutely include upgraded mechanical ventilation in classrooms and in assembly spaces. There's also, we understand the link between adequate ventilation and performance, and the school department makes sure that what we have is optimized, and what we're doing is providing more ventilation as we're moving forward. I would also note that these projects, I saw a lot of questions in the chat around efficiency, and the schools that we're working on to electrify absolutely include efficiency measures as well, to optimize the mechanical system. And then there's a lot of work that's being done across the board, again, around sort of optimization and right timing. So like if we're doing work on a roof, making sure that we're upgrading the insulation on the roof so that it has the maximum efficiency components, and same things with windows. When we have a new roof, we want to make sure we put in solar. So I think with a portfolio of this size, a lot of the work is around planning and strategizing how to make the best use of sort of existing work that will go on, so that we can incorporate ventilation, electrification, and efficiency as well.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Back over to you, Sarah. We might have time for one or two more questions.
Great. I guess I'll go back to Wyatt here for one more question on the cost side. Are the costs for Buckley that you presented, are those just for the ground source heat pump system, and how do you think about that within a broader cost environment? Like, were you able to deliver that project, which was net zero, a Renofit, and ground source heat pump? Like, how did the overall project cost per square foot kind of compare with a conventional approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the cost in the life cycle analysis I presented were specifically for the HVAC equipment. So I think, around $4 million upfront for the base case. And I think we ended up around $5 million. So about $1 million premium in total to upgrade to the HVAC system, plus geothermal, all the ventilation improvements, all the things that we did at that school when it was all said and done. And so the total construction cost, I think, came in around 27 million. I could be misquoting that. I'm not entirely sure, but I believe that's correct. So the well field itself was around $850,000 for that school. When you take into account what you're leaving behind when you switch to a geothermal system, so that's a big part of getting into the weeds of the cost estimate. You no longer need the boiler, you no longer need the cooling tower, you no longer need the natural gas service to the building potentially if you're fully electrified. There's a lot of things that kind of get reduced from those costs that can be missed. So all of those are factored in to the life cycle analysis, as well as maintenance cost savings, water cost savings, and then operational cost savings from energy savings, obviously. And then with the tax credit, in the case where we could have potentially, if this had happened a year later and Buckley could have leveraged the ITC, the way that is working, because I saw a bunch of questions in the chat about it. And so the reason that K through 12 public entities, they're tax exempt normally, the way that you can receive those tax credits is through what's called a direct payment. And so essentially what that's going to look like is the federal government is going to be cutting checks for the percents that you normally would have gotten from off of your tax bill. You're just getting that off of the cost of the system. And so there's a lot of guidance that's going to come out from the IRS here shortly, kind of explaining the details of how that payment process will look like. But that's the way that it will be implemented. And so that's how that would have impacted the front end financials of the system. Did that answer the question?
Perfect. Thanks, Wyatt. So you took us straight to the end of the hour. So I think that's our last question of the day. Thank you again to our three speakers for joining us, and thank you all for joining us as well. We hope that you are leaving feeling motivated to take action. Give that full report in our one-pagers a read, especially focusing in on those recommendations towards the end. We would love to hear from you too. So here are mine and Sarah's email addresses. We'd be happy to connect you with speakers if needed. And again, you will receive a recording of this webinar soon by email. So thank you again and have a great day, everybody.